So our final presenter, I guess we didn't plan it like this, but our final presenter has come from a place affected by natural disaster, and he's spent the last several years doing something about it. Joining us from Puerto Rico by way of Washington, D.C., please welcome Froilán Irizarry Rivera.
All right. Can everybody hear me? Yes. So, hello. First, thanks for staying for the last talk. This makes me happy. And thanks for the invitation, Christopher and the whole team here in North Bay Python. It's been a great conference. So I come here to talk about Python government and contracts, a tool to investigate corruption. But first, we're going to go back to 2017 to Hurricane Maria. When Hurricane Maria made landfall on Puerto Rico on September 20th as a Category 4 hurricane with winds up to 155 miles per hour, it was 24 to 32 hours of hell for people on the island. About a week later, 95% of the island had no cell phone service. Less than half of the population had tap water. 95% of the island was without power. Around a month after, 58% still had no cell phone service. 44% still had no water service. 89% still had no power. Moving on to 3 months later, 6.5% still had no cell phone service. 14% still had no water service. And 45% still had no power. That's over 1.5 million people. So I am Froilán Irizarry Rivera. I am currently working at GitHub. I've enjoyed interfacing with the open source community, making projects like the one I'm going to talk about today. I'm still very involved with the community and civic tech back home and in Washington, D.C. with Full Stack Knights, Code for DC, and I used to be the captain of Code for Puerto Rico. This is my partner in crime, Jose Padilla. He could not be here with us today, but he is also very involved with the community in Hartford, Connecticut. So let's talk about the María Tech Brigade. The María Tech Brigade was built out of desperation during the hurricane. It started with a group of friends that were living on the mainland U.S., and we were trying to console ourselves, help ourselves, trying to find things out for our family. And at the end of the day, one of us said, you know what? F all of this. Let's just do something about it. So we created this cockamamie idea called the María Tech Brigade, and in 2 weeks we had over 300 volunteers. The purpose of this was to provide tech relief to NGOs and the government of Puerto Rico. And from there we started seeing certain things that we could probably help, like in geospatial data. We interacted with the Red Cross and gave them a whole bunch of shapes from the island, try to help some other places with like small solar-powered microgrids, mesh networks, etc. Now, to their credit, the local government created a website called ContratosPR. The goal of the website was to give the people in a place that had no electricity the status of the services they lacked. So that worked fantastically well. The thing was that, yes, this was good from the perspective of people in the diaspora could see how things are going, governments could plan and more or less see what's going on. But Jose, which was part of the María Tech Brigade, saw that we could enhance this a little bit. So what he did was he would scrape hourly this ContratosPR website and aggregate all its data to give a historical view on how things were really happening, what was really happening. And we started seeing some really interesting patterns that the local government was not telling anybody about. Like, for example, seeing cell phone towers at 60% of up and then crash to 0 and then go up to 20. Like, all right. But they would never show that 0. It would go really quick from the site. Thankfully, he would capture it. So why am I still talking about what happened 2 years ago? Well, we're still dealing with the consequences of this emergency, but what I'm really here to talk about are suspicious contracts. So the Puerto Rico Power Authority, or PREPA as it's called, and we're going to focus on specifically 2 major contracts that they had dealing with this hurricane. The first contract was a $300 million contract to Whitefish Energy Holdings. The contract gathered a number of critics that focused on the lack of experience on the company of just 2 people. But honestly, for us and for a lot of other people, that wasn't really what caught our eye. For us, it was very suspicious that it stipulated that FEMA, which is the Federal Emergency Management Agency here in the US, had approved it. But FEMA denied any involvement with said contract. The Puerto Rico government could not audit the contract. That meant that they couldn't audit how the money was used, what contractors were put in place, anything about it. So, as you can imagine, this did not sit well with my fellow Puerto Ricans in the island, and after national outcry, the contract was pulled. Regardless on what opinions we might have about if this was okay or not, at the end, the taxpayer was left literally in the dark, without knowing what really happened. PREPA then went on with other shenanigans, like awarding a $200 million contract to Cobra Acquisitions. This was followed by a $900 million contract for a company that was founded in the second quarter of 2017. So this made it even younger than Whitefish. They also had obviously no other storm-related contracts because it is a new company. But they still threw out communications saying that we have 25 years of experience if you take into consideration everything our board has done. The deal had heavy input from FEMA, but Cobra had no prior dealings with PREPA. So why is this suspicious today? On September 10th, 2019, a FEMA official in Puerto Rico and the CEO of Cobra Energy were arrested by the FBI. Another FEMA official, along with these 2, was arrested and accused of defrauding the federal government. So still, after 2 years of dealing with the hurricane and everything else, we're still dealing with these consequences. In comes the Office of the Comptroller of Puerto Rico. So a year after Maria, Jose and I were made aware of this fancy website that the Comptroller of Puerto Rico had set up, where they were publishing absolutely every contract from different government agencies from around the island and entities in this website that was easy to for the citizens to look up whatever they wanted. Now, I'm referring to government entity as not just agencies, but also municipal governments, state government, and whatever other offshoot of Agency X that the state government had. And this is a site. So there's a couple of things that we didn't like about it. In our opinion, just having data available is not open data, and it's not usable. There are nuances to how government data works that most of us just don't know. Looking at the controller site says absolutely nothing about what fiscal year a contract was awarded in. There's no way to see simple tendencies, no metrics, and the search and filtering is incredibly rudimentary at best. This site assumes that you know what a government entity is. It assumes that you know the exact name of what you're supposed to look for. It assumes you know what a contractor is and what contractor are you looking for. In addition, the data is not machine consumable at all. There's no API. Large data analysis projects are incredibly time consuming without like reverse engineering endpoints that they have in like the JavaScript that they put out. At the end of the day, the people that need to consume this data for research and investigations just can't do it unless they spend a lot of time investing in figuring all of this out. And the most important fact is that the actual documents are sometimes not even there, right? So users need to click a series of buttons to petition a document to be released. And we're assuming that this petition process is somebody in some office saying, I have to redact some sensitive information or whatever else. That doesn't mean that it stays on the site either, at least as far as we can tell. To their credit, there's some contract documents that are still there, but we're still trying to see. And from all of this that I've just mentioned is what we decided to do ContratosPR about. We thought that it would be helpful to have all available data and the contract documents, text, indexed, and searchable on the same site. We wanted to help and serve the people that are protecting us from fraud and corruption. We are especially looking at journalists and investigative professors in like universities and civic activists. Thankfully, we have some places that actually do it right within government that give us inspiration on what the hell we're supposed to do with all of this. So the digital services, both in the US and the UK, are excellent at this. And when we saw usaspending.gov, we decided that is more or less what we want to provide. By the way, the site is amazing. Take a look at it. And so here's our site. Here's ContratosPR. Like I said, we wanted to help with discoverability, so we defaulted to have data already populated on the page. We do not want to assume that you know anything about government or anything about contracts. We assume that you want to just see numbers and get outraged and go on Twitter and insult the governor. So we also give you a really quick insight right at the top of the page before the search. So fiscal years, the amount of contracts, and the total for that fiscal year. Government data, like I said, can be really hard. At the very least, it could be a shit show. Most governmental agencies are not integrated with each other, let alone third parties. Data calls and reporting are not always efficient or handled with the care that people need. We felt that the experience on the controller site was made for compliance reasons instead for human consumption and analysis. So how you place, in our opinion, how you place data in front of a user has a huge impact on how they consume it and understand it. To that end, we added simple visualizations to help our users explore and find trends in the data that they're looking at and not need like a computer science degree to see what's going on. So we're at a Python conference. So why Python and why Django? Well, our primary thought was the batteries included because honestly, this is a side project, even though we're passionate about it and we are lazy. It really enabled us to get this running in close to about, like our initial thing was maybe 2 weeks, 3 weeks. Django's built-in feature for full text support along with Postgres also let us cut corners and save money without having to implement something like Elasticsearch. And this was a huge one for us, we wanted a place where we could see what documents we've already petitioned and a place where, and from the same place, say, give me this. So the admin in Django is incredibly suited for this, just some manage commands, and it is an incredibly powerful tool to ping the hell out of the controller site to give me my documents. And also the ecosystem. I mean, just like with the batteries included philosophy, we really do have an incredible ecosystem of third-party extensions that allow us to minimize the amount of wheels we need to reinvent. We're using Django REST Framework to power our API. It provided all the support we needed for pagination, filtering, authentication, and throttling, so it was really just slap it in and we didn't have to think about anything else. And it also supports OpenAPI schemas, which means that we can easily generate documentation and client libraries, which to us is incredibly important, primarily because we want people to use our things, and we don't want to add to the complexity of the data anyway. Speaking of data, although we're not data scientists, knowing that Python has one of, if not the most strongest data community, really like sealed the deal for us. The controller site provides all this information with no real insights, like I mentioned. So we wanted to help our users to formulate their own ideas, right? We didn't want to push our biases onto somebody that's investigating this data. We're also started to do our own trend section. This is extremely early. As you can imagine, with a lot of data calls within government, there's a mixed bag of good and bad data. So we're trying to like go through it and see what exactly is useful and what we can present to our users. And also the community, right? Last but not least, this community is amazing. The attention to detail that the community gives to things that matters to humans is refreshing, and we are building this for humans. All right, so we have 2 projects. So at the start, we had just one Django project. But later we started to think about who would use this. We wanted to give other people the chance to come up with their own interesting ways of displaying and visualizing this data. I mean, we have our ideas, but we really don't want to push it on anybody. And our intended audiences are probably different from somebody else's audience. Another big reason why was that we wanted separation of concerns. To us, the API should not care about which client it's calling. And we also didn't want to contributors to either project to have to learn a stack they don't want to learn to contribute. So whoever wants to contribute to the Python part can just focus on that. They don't have to learn any fancy JavaScript for our front end. So our REST API, like I mentioned, we're using Django REST Framework, Redis, Python, Postgres, Docker, Celery, and of course Django, all huge giants that thankfully we can stand on their shoulders. Our front end is called ContratosPR, and since we're building this API, we wanted to also build a client that would use it, just to give like examples as to what you can do with this. For those interested, we are using Next.js. It's a React framework. It is great for not worrying about Webpack, so we're incredibly grateful for not configuring that mess. All right, so one of our initial problem, was how to collect this data. And one of the most interesting parts was how early we had to optimize in this data collection. We've done scraping of government websites, and we knew we did not want to do that. So after some initial inspection, we found that the site had some endpoints that return JSON. Let's call this like a proto-API sort of thing. So we said, OK, one less thing to worry about. But we still had to work around some weird issues. For example, if this error, if you go to the controller site right now, you don't search for anything, just give me everything, and you go to the last page, it errors out. We don't know why. We are assuming that it just can't handle that amount of data, and what it's doing is putting all the database into memory, and it freaks out. So the initial intent, seeing this, was, OK, if it's doing that, we need something blazing fast. But our fast script affected the availability of their site. So we decided to be good citizens and do no harm, and we said, let's self-throttle, because that site has no throttling. Part of the solution was to get less total pages per request by filtering the data. But this presented another issue, which was, OK, so now we have to do more requests. And we had to figure out what was the correct amount of data that wouldn't make this site freak out, and also what amount of requests the site could actually handle without also freaking out. So this drastically increased our collection times to the point that the last time we collected any data, it took 24 hours. We decided to use Celery, because why not? Part of our initial script was a couple of Celery tasks that would have allowed us to distribute the load to a number of workers. And although we were not able to use a large amount of workers, we had a mechanism to retry tasks. So we decided to self-throttle, do more requests with less data, and just see what failed to try and just retry constantly. Because timeouts here are a very real thing. So first, we start by collecting the data from the site. This is fairly obvious. Right now, we have to collect all the data whenever we want to get updates. We are working on making this process a lot more efficient. But for right now, it wasn't a huge priority for us. We just wanted to get this data out. So we have collected 1.2 million contracts. That's our last collection. This is supposed to be the entirety of the contracts that have been reported to the controller's office from every single government agency in Puerto Rico. The second thing we had to do was start to normalize and augment the downloaded contracts with the amendments and contractor data. So we noticed that by sending some request parameters, we can get contract amendments. We noticed that there was another endpoint that had contractor data, and we started just merging those two together into one same place. The third thing was to store that data into a Postgres database. And this is the interesting part, downloading. So after we collect all this data, we know the universe of contracts that we have. With that universe, we now know what contracts we need to petition documents for. So up to now, we have found 195,582 documents. Definitely not the 1.2 million, so we still have buttons to press so that the government can give us those contracts. But downloading these contracts lets us do interesting things like this. So now we present the basic contract information with an embedded document, and we're also indexing the contents of said document just to make it searchable. Because again, throwing a PDF is not really sharing data all that well. What I just mentioned, we are extracting the downloaded documents and indexing them also in Postgres. So, open source and community are incredibly important to us from the start. In our opinion, a civic tech project that is not concerned with the community it is supposed to serve is just doing it wrong and is not going to be impactful. And we do really love community, but saying it just won't do anything. What are we doing about it? So we are striving to be very welcoming, and to that end, we've, from the start, placed a code of conduct, README, contributing files, basic stuff that we all expect from open source projects at this point. But something else that we did was implement some GitHub actions, primarily the greeting a new contributor. So whenever a new contributor goes and does an issue or a pull request, our fancy bot says, "Hi, thank you so much for this. We'll get in touch with you soon." It's a way to just make people feel at home, or at least in our opinion. We also made a space on spectrum.chat as a way to be away from maybe an interface like GitHub that maybe some people won't get it or won't feel comfortable using it. And these were not created as an afterthought. This was done at the very start of the project, even before our initial commit. We're also very interested in augmenting the contributor experience. Receiving contributions is really important to us. We've added issues and pull request templates to make things easier. Pre-commit hooks so that you don't have to worry about linting. We're using Black for code formatting. And we also recognize that a project like ours, especially for people outside of this room, might be very intimidating to set up. So we've done a fancy project setup that just lets you answer yes to questions, and it sets up pipenv, Docker, installs everything, boots up with a Docker Compose, and you can locally see our production database because we also download our latest database dump. Now, transparency as well is also paramount for us. I mean, we did start this project because of transparency, because of the corruption that is sadly rampant in Puerto Rico. But what are we doing about it? What are we planning? So we want to make our logs, our data collection logs, available somehow so that people can audit exactly what we're downloading and what we're doing with that collection. To us, it's really important that people that go to our site are ensured and are certain that we're not mucking around with the data when we get it, especially in a country that is ransacked with corruption. We also believe that our project expenses and our financial data should be public and auditable. So to accomplish this, we'll be adding that data somewhere in our repository. Currently, it's in an issue. We want to move it into either the README or some other area. We are also interested in financial sustainability. For the moment, Jose and I are taking care of the bill. We are privileged enough that we can take care of this without it being a drag for us. But we also don't want this project to rely just on us. We very much want this project to be viewed as an example for other developers on the island in what a community can do. And we thought that a good step is also to have that same community invest in infrastructure that will help them keep an eye on their government. So right now, our expenses are about $7 for the website and API hosting each, around $41.50 for the database, so it's close to $60. We've been looking into Open Collective, Buy Me a Coffee, GitHub sponsors, and Patreon for this support. We're still working things out, seeing how we can attract people for that. So, what's next? As it stands, we need to still process all the contract documents. We still need to extract all that data, and we need to actually do an index to have them searchable. We also want to create more insights and visualizations, not to push our agenda, but to serve as an example as to how people can contribute, not just with Python, but with other expertise. We want to get our hands on the Registry of Corporation and Entities. So why do we want to do this? I said before that sometimes government data calls are a dumpster fire. Having multiple agencies not talk to each other means that there is no data normalization, and there's no real sync in what an entity sometimes is. And forget about contractors. So one example is the contractor KOI, which thankfully is no longer around. Their name is KOI, or was. So when we start looking at the data, there's about 50 different KOIs, because somebody in some agency, in some entity, decided to write it differently. The only way we can really be sure that KOI LLC and KOI of America are the same company is with this data. Sadly, the Department of State in Puerto Rico does not have an API. We tried scraping that, and we drove us to drinking. But something good came out of promoting this tool. So another team actually got a data dump of every entity that is registered in Puerto Rico. So now we're working with them to see how to get that published outside of us and how we can integrate all that data into what we are building. And we want to do interviews. We want to specifically interview journalists. Why journalists? Most of the corruption scandals after Hurricane Maria did not come from inside the government. It was exposed by journalists. It was exposed by people that are, in my opinion, our first line of defense for government shenanigans. They took 2 years, but they went through all this data, and when they found all this cruft, they made it public. And that, for me, those are the people that I feel I need to serve with my expertise. And I invite all of you to think a bit on that and see what we can do to help the people that keep us informed. And we want to engage with all of you. We are just 2 developers from Puerto Rico that are doing this as a side project. we know for a fact that the brainpower in the Python community is awe-inspiring and amazing. Community is really important to us. You are really important to us. And we would love for you to maybe just give us your opinion. To wrap up, this past summer, a number of protests happened in Puerto Rico thanks to journalists revealing corruption. These protests ousted a corrupt governor and all of its cabinet. So this has really reinforced our determination that we as citizens need to be engaged in auditing our government, making sure they're doing things right, and enabling us to help ourselves manage our countries. Muchas gracias.